Hey guys, so today we're looking at a video from a YouTuber known as AlternateHistoryHub, and his video is titled, "What if Alexander the Great Never Died Young?" And I actually do know about this YouTuber. I remember watching him when I was like a teenager. Like, he's been around for a while. And I've seen a few of his videos. I think I saw the 1984 one, back when I was really obsessed with that book and his breakdown on that world. And, a few of his alternate history stuff. Now, interesting little fact about me, often in my free time, I actually like looking up, like, internet forums. I like to pose in questions, like, about history. Like, what if, let's say, the sack of Constantinople never happened? I'll usually Google that, and then I'll go on, like, forums, like AlternateHistory.com or just Reddit, discussions. And I kind of like just reading what people think, or what people have to say. One of my favorite topics that I've looked in the past was actually this one. What if Alexander didn't die young? What if he lived to like his 60s or, And often there's a lot of interesting thoughts people have. Some people are pretty optimistic. Like Alexander would have, raised new armies, probably would have gone even further east, or would have taken Arabia and then went westward and taken Rome and all that. And then there are some people who are like a bit more reserved in their predictions. They're like, well, he was planning an Arabian campaign. He probably would have taken that, then spend the rest of his life quelling rebellions. But then you'll have people argue that, like, no, Alexander ain't the kind of guy to just be idle. He'll keep conquering. And you get what I mean. There's a lot of interesting thoughts and opinions people have of what Alexander would do. And I love, like, going into forums and just reading what people predict or what they're thinking. So with that said, with that being a favorite pastime of mine, it's interesting that we've never watched a video from this YouTuber on this channel before. We're gonna have to fix that now, starting today. And, before I get started, feel free to leave a comment down below. What do you think would happen if Alexander had lived longer? Maybe till, again, 60s or older. How do you think things would have gone? What do you think he would have, how far do you think he would have gone if he didn't stop conquering? Just feel free to let me know what your thoughts are. Now, before I get started with the video, the link to this video is down in the description down below. Sorry. And if you want to help support my channel, and if you enjoy my content, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help my small but humble channel grow, and I would really appreciate it. With that said, and without any further ado, I've yapped long enough. Let's get to the video now, shall we? Let's watch Alternate History Hub's What if Alexander the Great Never Died Young?
Before we talk about Alexander the Great and empire and changing the course of history, I wanted to say this video has been sponsored by the new strategy. In the span of a decade, his empire had grown from a small peninsula to the entire known world, as far as anybody knew. Not once ever being defeated on the battlefield. His only weakness was the will of his own troops, tired and sick of campaigning for so long. After returning back to Babylon, the center of his new empire, and mourning the loss of his friend, Alexander died at the age of 32. In his mind, believing that he was a demigod, that his own men had failed him, and that there was more of the world to explore and conquer. Which is why it's always one of the great what-ifs in history. The question of what if Alexander the Great didn't die so young? It's relatively unclear on how that happened. He could have died from malaria or some other disease. He could have been poisoned by his own men after having them march across Asia for years. No matter what the cause, let's say in...
Yeah, that's an interesting thing we've kind of covered. What was the death of Alexander? We covered kings and generals telling, and there are two theories. Well, there are two ideas. There's, he died of sickness, malaria is usually the one people say. And then there's possibly an assassination. I kind of subscribe to the idea that it was the perfect storm of illness that got him. Like, think about it. Alexander was pretty messed up, like, physically. Like, all the injuries he sustained, like, even getting his, what was it, an arrow or, like, a dart pierced into his lung, and, you know, they removed it. But obviously, his surgery back then wasn't like before, so Alexander definitely had probably a lot of physical issues near the end from all his constant fighting he did on the front lines and the injuries he sustained. Also, he was kind of becoming quite the alcoholic near the end of his life. Like, he was always drinking, I think, which was in stark contrast to his earlier days when he was more known for more of restraint. But by the end of his life, I feel like Alexander definitely was losing some of that earlier restraint and kind of indulging a bit more in like drinking, for example, which didn't help in his health probably. And then just the sickness he got, like, I feel like it was the perfect storm to kind of kill him naturally, you know what I mean? But obviously there are people who do subscribe to the idea that probably one of his, you know, guys killed him. I mean, you know, many of the Macedonian kings were either assassinated or, you know, overthrown, and, you know, a lot of his people around him didn't like him, or were starting to not like him, like his higher-ups. I mean, the common soldiers, while they were getting tired of constant campaigning, there was starting to grow tension. There was still, I think, an overwhelming amount who loved him, but, like, the higher-ups, like, you know, his generals were quite xenophobic, and Alexander was becoming more Persianized, and, you know, that kind of were, like, that's pretty a good reason. Also, with the constant campaigning, Alexander even assassinating some rivals, like, what's the guy's name? Yeah, like Parmenion, and Alexander's more erratic behavior near the end of his life, like, you know, and considering that his generals, as we saw with the Diadochi Wars, were all very ambitious men in their own right, you know, I can see why someone thought they killed him, right? Especially considering, like, some of his successors didn't really care about his legacy, like Cassander kind of murdering his entire family. You know, I kind of made a joke that it was probably Ptolemy who killed him, because Ptolemy kind of wanted to start, you know, his incest dynasty in Egypt, and the only thing in the way was Alexander, so I kind of joked, like, oh, it was probably Ptolemy who killed him, you know, so he could have his incest. By the way, that was a joke. I know Ptolemy the first didn't practice incest. That's just kind of the joke I always propose when, when people are like, someone killed him. But in truth, I actually do believe he died naturally. Like, the perfect storm of his failing health, years of sustained injury and wear and tear, sickness, growing alcohol consumption. I just think the dude was definitely not well by the end of his days. So yeah, I don't know, what do you guys think? You think someone killed him, and if so, who? Or do you subscribe to the idea with me that it was more natural?
In this alternate timeline, Alexander continues to live on. I mean, he could probably still be ravaged by alcoholism, grief, and a deteriorating mental condition, but he happened to always defy the odds, and so he defies this. There were a few ideas on where he wanted to go after Babylon.
Yeah, I've heard it said that he was planning to conquer the Arabian coast, and then go westward to Carthage, and eventually tackle Carthage. That's usually the overall ideas I hear people propose in, like, forums and stuff. I've read that, you know, definitely the Arabian one, they seem pretty confident he was going to take that. I think even Kings in General has mentioned it. But I also think I've heard it said he had plans to go west and to really stick it to Carthage, maybe even to go to war and conquer Carthage. Because he did encounter them during the Siege of Tyre. The Carthaginians were kind of around, but then they bailed. So Alexander was familiar to some degree with the Carthaginians, you know?
In this alternate timeline, Alexander decides to follow through with a plan to invade Arabia, or at least the coastline of Arabia. This would be one small victory before then heading back home. I'm going to be honest, a lot of what you're going to hear is just a creative guess. I will, however, be basing this whole scenario on one concrete fact. Alexander the Great love to conquer. So
Yeah, this is what I love about alternate history stuff. It's just fun to speculate, and it's like, you can't really say someone's wrong, because at the end, who knows what would have happened, so it's kind of more fun to speculate, right? So by all means, be however you want, alternate history hub. Like, you're technically not wrong. You can't be wrong, because it never happened, you know what I mean? Yeah.
while the specifics of where he would go and what he tried to conquer are left to interpretation, Alexander would always continue on fighting. That said, a leader is only as good as those that follow him, and much of his generals and army were not in a mood to continue the war. The Persians were defeated, most of the world that mattered was under their control, and all many wanted to do was go back home and enjoy their riches. Let's say enough time passes and enough enemies are determined to be around, then Alexander's military and generals could be up for another invasion. But where to?
Okay, that's an interesting thought. I think by the end of his life, I could be wrong about this, but that Alexander was actually raising up, like, more troops, mainly from, like, Persia. You know what I mean? He was actually raising up, I think, like, what, the number's like 30,000 or something, like, training Persian recruits in the Macedonian way of war. So it seemed like he was raising up at least another army, or, you know, probably just more troops to sustain his already main army. And that he may have used another army down the line, since his main one was kind of getting sick of all the fighting. But then again, there's also the idea that, like, you know, when you think of the successor kingdoms, the main core, like, with the Diadochi, like the Seleucids, the Ptolemy, the main core of their armies were Macedonians, at least, like, in the most important parts. That's why the successor kingdoms kind of tried getting Macedonian settlers into their territories, so they can still have them as kind of the bulk, because I think they didn't want to give the conquered people too much power, or else they might realize they can be overthrown, you get me? That's something I've heard, and that was kind of like with the Battle of Raphia, between the Seleucids and under Antiochus III and Ptolemaic Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt levied a lot of natives into their phalanx and into their corps, which wasn't that usual. Not to say they didn't use natives, but, like, I think he mainly used them, and that was irregular. And then even after winning against Antiochus, he had to deal with a lot more revolts, probably the natives realizing, oh, we can kind of get rid of these you know, foreign overlords. So, and Alexander was kind of known for his charisma. Maybe he could have kept the natives on his side, since he was trying to kind of be, like, respectful to them and their culture, even kind of becoming Persianized. But I don't know if he would have to like struggle with that, you get me? He would need to keep some type of core Macedonian unit in the center of his phalanx, you know? But it's an idea that he could have been raising more armies, so maybe, you know, cycle them out. Again, I think that the main problem would be if he relies too much on the natives and how the natives feel about that. But who knows? I guess with this scenario, he's going with the main army of his veterans that he had under Philip, and he's just gonna keep them. So, alright. So I just needed to put that out there. That was something interesting.
Already went east, can't really go further south, and Macedonia, despite controlling so much of the world, still had the savages on their doorstep. It's not the craziest thing to imagine that the homeland would need a buffer, or some other reason. I don't know, Alexander needs to convince everyone to go invade the barbarians, not me. There's some evidence that Alexander wanted to go west. Greece at this time already had multiple colonies across the Mediterranean Sea. So let's say we got everyone on board somehow, Alexander is in good shape, and there's a decent enough reason to go fight the Illyrians or anybody else. Off we go. While fighting in the mountains, especially in the Balkans, is always a risky move, Alexander's military had experience through mountainous terrain. The Illyrians are quickly stunted, and Alexander's army goes north until reaching the Danube, going west, fighting Celts, Gauls, Rhaetians, and Veneti along the way. So here's the main question: who would win? A Greek phalanx or a Celtic horde? Luckily, we actually have a way to figure this out.
Yeah, I think when we watched the Diadochi series by Kings and Generals, wasn't it the Gauls that invaded the territories of Greece and you know, the Diadochi? I do remember that the Seleucid kingdom actually managed to defeat the Gauls, at least through their war elephants, because the Gauls had never seen such things, and though the Gauls did get pretty far and did do damage, they were, I think, eventually pushed out. So, you know, that was definitely under the successor kingdoms. I know this is kind of a bit different groups, but you know what I mean. I think a unified Alexandrian empire definitely could really, like, do damage to anyone.
After Alexander's death in our timeline, there was a series of invasions from the north by the Celts. The Celts spread...
Gauls or Celts? I apologize. I could have sworn that Kings and Generals used the term Gauls. It was the Gauls who did it. But either way, we'll go with Celts. I probably misremembered, and I'm not sure if they're two different groups or not, I'm sorry. But point is, yeah, the Celts were actually beaten back by the successor kingdom, so all unified under Alexander, I think he would kind of demolish them, you know what I mean?
Fast. However, they were beat back by the Greeks after only a few years, driven back up north, never really to be seen again or fight against the Greeks. So Alexander, with some luck and strategy, would make good work of any opposing force that tries to resist, going west into an open Italian peninsula. This would be so early in Italy's history that Latin is not a commonly spoken language at all. In fact, it's only in one specific region. The rest of the peninsula is a collection of cultures and languages not yet influenced by Rome. Southern Italy was also populated by Greeks. These various Italian cultures of the ancient world, including the Latins, are slowly assimilated and eventually lost to history, their language and culture forgotten. From here, I could imagine that Carthage would be next, and unlike Italy, Carthage's culture and civilization would continue to live on. From this, Carthage would be...
Okay, that's interesting. You know, there's been a lot of speculation. I think a lot of people kind of always wanted Rome versus Alexander the Great. Like, that's kind of like a big alternate history forum I've seen. Like, could the Romans have defeated Alexander? And, obviously, you know, later Romans who were more accustomed to the phalanxes and stuff, if not through, even if Alexander, well, I won't get into it, there's a lot to talk about that, but point is, I think at his time, I do think Alexander, in my opinion, would have taken the Romans out in his time. I mean, 40 years removed from Alexander, I think it was 40 years, Pyrrhus of Epirus fought the Romans, and he managed to beat them 2 times. And the thing is, with the Romans at that time, they mainly just had manpower, though they did do damage to Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, obviously, with Pyrrhic victories, was winning. But, the Romans at that time had much more manpower and could just keep funding new armies. And the thing is, Pyrrhus still did best them twice and do damage to the Romans. And Pyrrhus was a small-time player at his time. He wasn't one of the great Diadochi. He was, you know, he was from Epirus. Epirus was kind of a, you know, a very small-time player among the great Diadochi successor kingdoms. Though Pyrrhus was so talented, he could kind of go to toe-to-toe with like, the Macedonians and stuff. But Pyrrhus didn't have much resources or the manpower, you know, to... He didn't even have, like, the proper siege equipment to besiege Rome. I think when he saw the Roman city, he was like, I can't besiege that, like, the walls are too great, and he kind of just left. you know, he could never besiege Rome and kind of deliver the death blow. In Alexander's time, not only would Alexander have more manpower, more resources, but also great siege work. Like, Alexander and his siege work was kind of the best of his time. So I do think, even if I think he could take out the Romans. In his time, obviously. You know, and yeah, in this scenario, in our world, right? Rome was the big empire of the world, right? The West mainly, and its influence is still felt today. In this timeline, it would be the Greeks. I mean, granted, Greek culture actually is the most influential because the Romans adopted it and kind of spread it indirectly. So technically, it would just be even more Greek. Alexander's empire could potentially, if it lasts longer with older age, could have been the Rome of this universe. You know what I mean? So that's an interesting thousands of years of history rewritten.
Connected via a new road from the city of Alexandria. Now keep in mind, we're assuming this whole time that he never loses a battle, nor finds himself with a large amount of casualties. Perhaps driven by a need to reach at least some end of the world, Alexander and his army continue to push on, wishing to reach the Atlantic. So, cool. Alexander could have conquered more territory and also prevented the Roman Empire from existing. We get it, Cody. Ah, well, you see, this whole territory conquering would not actually be the greatest change in our timeline. It's time we discuss royal lineage and the importance in pre-Enlightenment societies of divine rule. In our timeline following the death of Alexander, he was deified in Ptolemaic Egypt. This was a political action as well as a religious one, perpetuating Alexander's divinity while also coincidentally linking the royal family with the Greek/Egyptian pantheon to the people. The right of absolute monarchs to do whatever they wished came from the gods. Alexander said, at least, that he believed he was a demigod. For the sake of their own rule, the descendants of Alexander may prop up a cult to worship him, even generations after his death. In the West, the Mediterranean is only further solidified as a Greek pond, with Italy and Carthage assumingly under Macedonian control. The only interaction any barbarian tribe might have with a prominent civilization is through the Greeks, and never the Romans. Without Latin, the writing system of Western Europe is instead based on the Greeks. No shock there. But without such a blatant genocide of the Gallic people, we'd see a writing system that blends Celtic and Greek, forming a wide range of alternative writing systems we can't even imagine. Think about how the Slavic people...
You know, that's another interesting thought I had. Like, you know, Alexander was trying to, you know, we kind of call him Persianized by the end of his life, right? Taking Persian dress and customs. It's believed that Alexander was trying to unify his empire culturally. You know, he was a pharaoh of Egypt, a king, basically the king of the Greeks, becoming more Persianized and allowing the Persians to essentially treat him like a god. Like, all this culture surrounding one guy, it would be interesting, because we already know that even though Alexander died young and his empire fractured, the Hellenized period was very influential, you know? The period between the death of Alexander and the rise of the Romans, that period in between the Hellenistic age was very influential, in spreading, you know, these ideas. Essentially, you would have that, but even more in this alternate history, right? Way more Greek influence than even already in our world. And the Greek culture is already beyond influential westward. You know, the Romans were basically kind of Greekified in their own way. Like, they took on Greek customs and Greek culture, and there's a saying that, you know, the Romans captured the Greeks, but the Greeks captured the Romans' hearts, something like that. But essentially, culturally, the Greeks conquered the Romans. So already in our timeline, in our main universe here, Greek culture already, like, influenced so much of the world westward, you know? Essentially, in this scenario, it would be that times 10. Like, Greek culture would essentially be what Rome is in our timeline, right? Alexander's empire. And again, this is very, how do you say? Definitely, a more positive outlook. Like, again, we're assuming Alexander doesn't get assassinated, we're assuming he doesn't lose a battle, and we're assuming he just keeps dominating. And again, he was pretty dominant in our timeline, like, so it's not too unfair. But then again, you think of, like, people like Napoleon. Alexander dying young is what really solidified his greatness in the world. I think, like, it would be like it would be like, think about, like, Napoleon, for example. Let's say Napoleon dies, like, immediately after the War of the Fourth Coalition or something. Like, Napoleon would kind of, I mean, his legacy is already great, like, no one can dispute him as one of the greats, but he would probably have an aura of complete invincibility if he had died, like, pre-Spanish and Russian invasion, right? When he was the dominant force in Europe. And then we would probably be making alternate history. Like, what if Napoleon survived past, the, you know, War of the Fourth Coalition? And obviously, maybe people would be more optimistic. Oh, he would have gone on to dominate the rest of his life or stuff. But we know in real life, he fell. Made mistakes, and eventually that led to his doom. You know, who's to say Alexander won't eventually make a mistake? Or then again, like, again, I know that's kind of a bit different. I'm just trying to put this out here that definitely there could be a potential for things not to completely go as smoothly as they did in most of Alexander's life, and maybe he finally suffers at least one loss, or meets a challenge that he can't instantly overcome, you know? Or maybe he would have just kept dominating and never lost, and just essentially, you know, like he kind of did in our life, in our reality. I don't know, what do you guys think? You think Alexander would have eventually lost to somebody? Well, let me know.
Adopted writing from the Byzantines, taking their form of Greek and transforming it into what's known as Cyrillic today. Without Rome, there is never the spread of Christianity, nor the adoption of any Middle Eastern religion. Monotheism is not the norm. Pagan pantheons of any region still remain. There is no Vatican, which seats itself in Rome. There is no continuation of Rome, a title that was coveted and respected throughout the Middle Ages, even after the empire itself fell. Instead, we're in an alternate world where the bedrock of Western civilization is one conqueror, and any ruler coming after him would just be like the generals of our own timeline and try to claim legitimacy through Alexander. I'd imagine his legacy and achievements may be worshipped in the same way as, say, the Emperor of Mankind from 40k, and his Son of God status being a militaristic alternative to Jesus.
That is so interesting, right? Like, a world completely built by Alexander. You know, like, in our world, Rome, like he mentioned, is the bedrock of, like, Western society. In this alternate scenario, Alexander's that instead. One dude. Oh, man. There's just thousands of possibilities of how things could go. Like, how could anything go in a world without Rome? Wow, that gets you thinking. There's, like, it's hard to even put into words, because there's just thousands of things that can happen. No, not even thousands, like millions, I feel. So many speculation and ways you can go with that. It's making my head hurt just trying to process all of it. Wow. Yeah, in an alternate reality, I would be sitting here covering, like, not Roman videos, but whatever Alexandrian videos. I guess it's not Rome, it's Alexandria, right? Or we'll call that, since Alexander liked to or Macedon or something, you know? Such a unique alternate history. idea. Yeah, there's also the thing is how long it lasts, right? That kind of factors. This empire built by Alexander would have to last for a while. And like retain influence, right? Like Rome lasted like thousands of years. This empire would have to last like centuries and not fracture. But then again, that's a little hard because of how big Alexander's empire was and how even like, you know, the successors had trouble holding on to stuff. Like the Seleucids were losing influence like so quickly in their time eastward, right? So it would have to be like this empire would have to last a while, like the Romans did. And that's the only way it can really be that influential. It would really have to last centuries. Which, again, territory that big might be hard to do unless they have some really competent emperors after Alexander. But, again, that's a lot of speculation there. Yeah, Alexander could end up becoming a god across everywhere.
Yeah,
No democracy, no republic. It's all Alexander, baby.
I'm gonna be honest. This is still the best case scenario for the Great. In a more realistic, alternate world where Alexander the Great had not died when he did, it's most likely that his keys to the kingdom, his generals and his followers, would have just been done with him, if they didn't do away with him in our timeline already. They wanted to retire rich, and with their new spoils of war. The Persians were defeated, and that was the main thing that mattered. And Alexander, over the years, had become increasingly more erratic and less Greek, dressing in Persian clothing, and even wishing for his own men to address him like a Persian god king, by which they outright refused.
Yeah, that's interesting about how the Macedonians and their relationship with the king was much more unique in that they were more open to talk to the king. Like, usually when we think of, like, kings and servants, you know, it's definitely like you don't question the king at all. You have to be as completely respectful as you can. Not to say they couldn't show they didn't have to show Alexander respect, but like they could be more open in speaking with him. You know, I think that's what kings and generals talked about. Like, that was kind of unique among the Macedonians, how they were more frank with their king, and how they could just straight up, like, say, no, we're not gonna bow to you, dude. Like, what? We're not gonna worship you. Again, yeah. There is also the case that Alexander, assuming in this timeline, he doesn't try to raise other armies and still tries to keep his main one. Yeah, considering that they were already mutinying near the end of his life, and considering he was kind of, again, losing his marbles a bit with his grief, his alcoholism, and stuff, he could have been killed, you know what I mean? Assuming he wasn't already assassinated in our timeline, even if he lives for longer, there's a chance he could get Philip, you know what I mean? And probably killed. Maybe even lose some of his prestige. Because I feel like I said earlier, him dying young really preserved his aura of greatness and invincibility. He didn't live long enough to, like, a Napoleon, for example, to make mistakes. Or like a Caesar to eventually get killed by someone, right? Again, assuming if you believe he wasn't assassinated. Secretly, but you know, realistically, maybe he goes the Napoleon route, like Napoleon, when he reaches zenith of power after the War of the Fourth Coalition, now the most powerful man in the world, made mistakes which really messed him up in the long run. Who's to say maybe Alexander couldn't make some type of mistake, and, you know, maybe suffer a loss or setbacks that would diminish his greatness. You know, he wouldn't go out at the peak of his power, in a sense, you get me? Again, like I said, there's so much ifs, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
If Alexander had the love of his military like he did when they first set off to Persia, then sure, his army could have conquered the Mediterranean. Yet by this point, after 13 years, with his closest friend dead and his mental state deteriorating, he was more of a liability than anything. Had Alexander not died in Babylon, he probably still would have led an invasion into Arabia. It probably would have been successful, and then he would have retired into Macedonia, simply maintaining the land that he had conquered.
You know, this is an interesting one. Like, some of the alternate history comments and forums I mentioned earlier, some people thought, alright, he takes Arabia, maybe Carthage, and then just chills out and spends the rest of his life quelling rebellions and really solidifying his hold. But again, some people have even commented or kind of trying to argue against that. Like, Alexander ain't the kind of guy to just chill out and stop conquering. Alexander needed to keep conquering, and he probably would have kept trying. So I don't know. I guess that kind of depends, guys, you know? And some even say he wouldn't have been a good ruler because Alexander would much rather conquer than actually sit down and govern. Though he was trying to make some efforts in his timeline, which weren't that popular with the Macedonians, like taking on more Persian customs, but I don't know, that's kind of thing. You think Alexander could have ever just chilled out and just stopped conquering, or do you think that was an itch he could never fully scratch and he just needed to keep going and going and going? Huh.
While also alienating his own guard by being such a weeb for the Persians. As you see, Alexander would have wished for Persian and Greek culture to blend in his new empire, and whether or not that would have been a success, we'll never know. Had he been successful in his goals and continued to live on, this area of the world might have become far more unified and culturally linked without his generals ever taking over. Had Alexander lived just a little bit longer, there was a chance that his dynasty might have continued far after his death. But we will never know how Alexander IV would have ruled, as he was killed along with his mother in a purge of Alexander's heirs. Gee, thanks, generals. But
to be fair, that was Cassander who went AWOL and killed Alexander's mom and his wife and his son. I mean, they all definitely caused trouble, but Cassander was trying to rack up the most kills for Alexander's relatives. He was competing with them in that sense.
Even though Alexander's generals did divide the empire amongst themselves, and could never imagine mixing Greek and Persian cultures, or Greek with any culture for that matter, there is a way for you to be able to, right now.
Alright guys, so he's done, and yeah, that was the video. Overall, there's a lot of questions I asked, but feel free to let me know, what do you think would have happened if Alexander had lived longer? Let's just say 60s. I keep saying the 60s. What do you think if he had those extra 30 years? Do you think his empire would have been a success? Do you think it would have had the staying power of the Romans, for example, and went on to be the Rome of that alternate universe in a sense, as the most important empire westward and stuff? Do you think Alexander would have even lived to fully consolidate? Do you think he would have chilled out, or he would have kept conquering? You think he would have died a natural death or been assassinated? You think he would have ever had an actual defeat? Let me know. So many questions, so much to speculate, so feel free to let me know. And I'll see you guys. I love this video, by the way. We should do more of these. More alternate history, please.